Hello, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Life in Surround, which I think I have decided to dub Life and Death in Surround. I want to walk through some of the story of basically Chris Cornell's music as it's represented in Surround, and some of the peripheral artists and recordings that are associated with his career and with his death as well. What has prompted this is the recent release, brand new, Soundgarden live at the Artist's Den. We will discuss the mix a little bit, but I just want to kind of give the bottom line up front that this sounds incredible. It's a cool performance, and I recommend it. You should pick this up, okay? So Soundgarden live at the Artist's Den, recommended. So let's jump into the Chris Cornell story a bit, and his connection with surround music and some peripheral recordings and some other peripheral artists. We would need to begin this story back with the death of Andy Wood, who was the singer for Mother Love Bone, a Seattle area band. Now, they had the stated goal of basically being the next Motley Crue, and Andy Wood in particular had a flashy, glam kind of style about him. And the band, musically, were heavy hard rock. He died, orphaning his bandmates. And that's where Chris Cornell comes into the picture, a veteran singer and musician with the band Soundgarden, took them under his wing and formed the temporary band known as Temple of the Dog. They put out one album together, recruiting Eddie Vedder for lead vocal on one song and backup vocals for other tunes. Chris Cornell basically did this to build confidence back into these musicians who had just experienced a tragedy, and to be a bit of a mentor and supportive to them. And from that effort, we received the Temple of the Dog album, which years and years and years later received this deluxe treatment, including a 5.1 mix on Blu-ray, and we'll get to that. Soundgarden went on to record an album known as Superunknown, and it eventually received this deluxe version with the lenticular cover, and a 5.1 mix also on Blu-ray. Unfortunately for us, the Soundgarden album Badmotorfinger also received a deluxe version. Now, I don't have the ultra big box anymore with a bunch of extra CDs, DVDs, and the big spinny wheel on the front. I rescued the Blu-ray from the set and sold the set without it, clearly marked no Blu-ray on eBay, and even messaged the buyer making sure they understood they were not getting the Blu-ray. So I just have the Blu-ray left over from that set. That's sometimes how I choose to afford this hobby. Now, a couple of years ago, Chris Cornell took his own life and is no longer with us. And that leads me to the last peripheral recording and artist that I want to talk about today, and that would be Chester Bennington of Linkin Park. Now, fortunately for us as surround enthusiasts, this album, Reanimation, has received an incredibly bonkers must-hear mix. If you can tolerate kind of an electronic remix styling of nu metal, this is an insane mix on DVD audio, highly recommended. So the reason I bring up Chester Bennington is that he was friends with Chris Cornell, and Cornell's death grieved him so much that within a few months he took his own life in the same fashion on Chris Cornell's birthday. So life and death in surround. We have Linkin Park's Reanimation, we have Soundgarden's Badmotorfinger. We have Soundgarden's Superunknown. We have the Temple of the Dog album. And we have Soundgarden's latest release, Live from the Artist Den, all in surround. And, it's a tragedy that we've lost Chris Cornell. It's a tragedy that we also lost Chester Bennington, especially to the avoidable death of suicide. And it's hard to know what factors all went into their decisions and their actions, but I think it's safe to say that it's really tough to be a rock star. It's tough to be the front man for a band. And a band isn't just a collection of people playing music anymore. It's a business, and there are lots of pressures. Makes me sad thinking about it, but at least we do have some recordings to remember them by and to enjoy. And to me, it just underscores the point that life is precious. We don't know when it will end. And I intend to enjoy it while it lasts. So let's get on to talking about these mixes that feature Chris Cornell. First, let's start with Soundgarden Live from the Artist Den. Like I said, very recently released. I just got it a couple of days ago. I have had a chance to give it a listen. And what I will say is this. Mixed by Chad Bamford, what he went for was the experience that you were there at the show. You don't have any crazy whiz-bang stuff dedicated to the surrounds. This is extremely typical for concert mixes, so I would never fault a Blu-ray for having this style of mix. The band and Cornell's voice are actually pushed out in the room a bit more than some concert mixes, so this is an immersive experience. They just haven't chosen to discreetly put any musical parts back in the surrounds, and for this show, I think that's appropriate. I appreciate that I'm given the experience of being there at the show, since I was never able to experience Soundgarden live myself. All of the parts represented here, Cornell's guitar playing, Kim's guitar playing, bass guitar, drums, Cornell's voice could not be any clearer. Especially the drums. I was just floored watching this, the detail that comes through on the drums, the power of the kick and the snare in particular. My takeaway musically from this show is I had no idea how good Cornell was at guitar. He often is doubling Kim on guitar or supplying slightly different parts, often with fairly intricate riffs, off-time type of stuff, while he's singing. So that was extremely impressive to me. This is a mainly great performance and well worth picking up if you're a Soundgarden fan at all. Okay, just don't expect any surround pizzazz. So now let's talk about Adam Kasper's mixing philosophy, because if I understand correctly, he did Superunknown, Badmotorfinger, and Temple of the Dog. Although, like I said, I sold my Badmotorfinger set, and so I don't have access to the credits. I have good reason to assume that Adam Kasper did it, but if I recall correctly, what was put out first was the Superunknown Deluxe. Alright, this has tons of discrete stuff in the surrounds, particularly guitar overdubs, and often like the main guitar parts. Delays and echoes of vocals. Has some of the drums spread out into the surrounds. So the album is represented pretty well in the surround field. The problem with this 5.1 mix is that it has this compressed, boxed-in, contained sound, especially compared to Badmotorfinger and Temple of the Dog. And then like the more hard rockin' type of songs usually don't have a very exciting surround mix. There are some standouts, like Black Hole Sun, 4th of July, The Day I Tried to Live. There are some standout mixes to be had on this 5.1 Blu-ray. And there is a reasonable degree of separation of parts, clarity, and for grungy hard rock music, it really isn't all that bad. I just don't recommend putting this on after Badmotorfinger, and we'll get to that. And so another interesting feature of Adam Kasper's mixing philosophy is that he puts a lot of dry vocal in the center channel and a lot of dry snare in the center channel. You have some dry kick in there as well, but it's mixed relatively low compared to the vocal and the snare. You have a lot of guitars in the front, left, and right. Drums predominantly have their presence in the front, left, and right. He treats the surrounds mostly as supportive, with reverbs, but also occasionally guitar overdubs or accent parts of the songs, like a guitar solo might show up in the surrounds. Like I said, the echoes from vocals might show up in the surrounds. This just isn't as powerful, punchy, heavy, or thick as I think it could have been. And you know, it may have been simply the case that it was an early mix for Adam, and it may also have been a limitation of the way the album was recorded, because this sounds so different from the deluxe Badmotorfinger and Temple of the Dog that, like, something happened. But as we can see over on Quadraphonic Quad, I have voted an 8 for this. It's still solidly within my recommended range. Just understand that it does have this kind of boxed-in compression thing going on, and it sounds like some of the parts may have been recorded in the red, and you're going to have not the most pleasant experience in terms of sonics, but you are going to have like a very raw, grungy sounding experience. Then next, I believe Badmotorfinger came out, and people were wondering, because of the limitations of Superunknown, if Badmotorfinger was going to suffer the same treatment. And I am here to tell you that this Blu-ray is just the most amazing way that you will ever be able to experience this album. It's heavy. It may be the heaviest album in my entire collection. It's thick, but you have separation, you have very interesting things that are done with the mix. He has the same basic philosophy: dry vocal, dry snare, dry kick in the center, drums mainly in the front, left, and right. And even more so than on Superunknown, you mainly have guitar 1 and guitar 2 up in the front, left, and right, and pushed into the surrounds though, like they're in kind of the phantom sides. You do get some flashy moments, such as during Rusty Cage, when the opening guitar riff do-do-do-do-do-do starts in the front left, but-do-do-do-do-do, and the response shows up in the surround right. And Rusty Cage is also a good example of when a vocal part begins up in the front of the room and permeates back to one or the other or both of the surrounds, like in a delay or echo fashion. Now, I am describing somewhat of a big stereo or a double stereo kind of mix with certain parts kind of punctuating your experience with the use of the surrounds. And I don't want to be that unfair to Kasper's style, because I did put on Badmotorfinger simply in stereo, and then I ran it through a variety of up mixers, Dolby Surround, RO3D, and though there are some cool things that are achieved this way, you get particularly like some reverbs only show up in the surrounds that way, and some of your higher parts like hi-hat and ride and crash cymbals show up more in the surrounds. It's a less powerful, less thick, less heavy, less awesome experience than Kasper's 5.1 mix. And he has used the entirety of the available channels in 5.1 to give you an immersive, powerful experience, particularly in the way that bass shows up in all channels, kick drum, toms, snare shows up in all channels. You have a super, super, super powerful sound that can't be achieved with just your stereo speakers up front, or even with upmixing a stereo signal back to your surrounds. It just is not the same powerful experience at all. So the experience of listening to Casper's Badmotorfinger in 5.1 is badass and absolutely wholeheartedly recommended. And then of course we have Temple of the Dog. I'm pretty sure it came out after Badmotorfinger, but don't quote me on that, or better yet, correct me on that down in the comments if you find out differently. It came out in this rather cool, in my opinion, box. I think it's right around 7 inches, so I can put it up against my 7-inch SACDs from Japan. It has this like magnetic flap that opens up the artwork, and then inside you have a lenticular print and a booklet full of cool facts, a poster of the band, and then this like housing that has some CDs and the all-important Blu-ray. And nice art style. So anyway, I really dig this box. I think I was eventually able to find it for somewhat less than an arm and a leg. I love this album. You get some decent bonuses with this, particularly a Pearl Jam concert that Cornell sat in on, and they had like a 20th anniversary reunion of all of the Temple of the Dog members, and they run through 5 of those songs. And though that's in stereo, live at Alpine Valley, 20th anniversary reunion of the Temple of the Dog members, is so powerful and raw but well performed that it's almost worth the price of the set just for those 5 songs. But then you also get the 5.1 mix of the album. And let's take a second to talk about the bonuses that you get with each of these sets, particularly the 5.1 Blu-ray. Superunknown is pretty disappointing because all you get is the album in 5.1, and it does have some cool graphic artwork that accompanies each song, but you don't get interviews, you don't get B-sides, you don't get promo videos synced up with anything. Moving forward to Badmotorfinger, you now get 3 promo videos synced up with the lossless 5.1 mixes. You get a few B-sides mixed in 5.1, and as with Superunknown, you get pretty cool graphics that accompany each song. And with Temple of the Dog, you also get some pretty nifty graphics that accompany each song, and you get several live clips, 2 of which are well worth watching over and over again. One is really rough and is really just there for historical reasons, in my opinion. You get Hunger Strike synced up with the lossless 5.1 mix. So in terms of value, I'm going to say that you get the most out of Badmotorfinger, you get the next most out of Temple of the Dog, and lastly you get the least out of Superunknown. And also it has the least good sound. So that does go into my evaluation. With Live at the Artist Den, you get a bonus interview, which I haven't seen yet, but I am looking forward to. Now let's talk about the Temple of the Dog mix. It is basically Casper's mix philosophy from the other 2 albums, but I want to talk about the controversy that Eddie Vedder's guest lead vocal on Hunger Strike is mixed into the surrounds, and this is not pleasant for some listeners, and I think that can come down simply to preference. They would just prefer for lead vocals always to be up in front, and that's fair. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. We all have our preferences, we all have our tastes. I think that some of the criticism that may have been levied over the years has been possibly due to home listeners' systems being calibrated differently than Casper's system. In other words, I have an assumption that Vedder's and Cornell's vocals sounded balanced to Casper in his mixing studio. It so happens that on my system they also sound balanced. They have equal power, they have equal presence. Cornell's just coming from in front of me and Vedder's coming from around me. I find this to be a super cool effect. I love it. It actually is a highlight of the album and the mix for me. I just think it's sad that it is a detraction and a low light of the mix for some other listeners. So for what it's worth, to set up my system, I have my surrounds as close to the industry standard of 110 degrees as possible, as close to ear level as possible, and I run like automatic Odyssey room correction on my system, which provides some leveling, some EQ, and like a kind of a distance delay type of thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think I have a reasonable assumption that my system is calibrated according to industry guidelines, and so I think that helps me to some reasonable degree hear what the mixing engineer intended. And in that sense, like I said, for this Temple of the Dog 5.1 mix, Hunger Strike, I'm hearing Cornell and Vedder in very close balance. And I happen to like the effect that Cornell and Vedder have a huge amount of separation because one is in front of you and the other somewhat behind you. I think it was a risky choice on the part of Casper, but it works for me. I am sad that it doesn't work for all listeners because this is a marvelous album. It's a great mix. It is mostly like Superunknown and Badmotorfinger in terms of Casper's placement of parts. And to me it just fires on all cylinders. It has guitar parts in the surrounds when the opportunity arises. It has background and lead vocals in the surrounds. It spreads the drums out into the room reasonably well. It's a very, very, very powerful but clear and well separated representation of this album. It is just an awesome experience for me, and I'm so glad that this album came out in surround and received a great mix. We can see over on Quadraphonic Quad that I've given it a 10. So that's the rundown of quite a few surround albums. We covered Linkin Park's Reanimation, a couple of Soundgarden albums, Temple of the Dog album, and the new Soundgarden Live Blu-ray. As always, you help out the channel if you can give me a like. If you didn't like this video, go ahead and give me a dislike. Either way, leave your comments, suggestions, requests, memories of these albums, your experiences with Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Mother Love Bone, Linkin Park, Temple of the Dog. I look forward, as always, to your insights and just to sharing our beloved hobby together. And as I said before, life is short and it's very precious. Life can end so unexpectedly for our heroes and for ourselves. So while it lasts, I'll encourage you, as always, to live life in surround.